What is the answer to Nagi's question in chapter 302? And I'm talking about the why couldn't I have tried harder one, not the why am I so miserable one, but I will of course talk about both. Firstly, it's pretty clear that what I said in my previous Nagi video about how maybe he'll stop playing football and see it as not for him was just completely incorrect. But that makes things a lot more interesting because now we get to look into, as he said, what stopped him trying harder. Because that's such a painfully real feeling, the regret of what could have been if I tried harder. And it's quite a complicated topic when it somehow happened to something that you enjoy. Obviously when it's something you don't, it's a bit of a simpler discussion. And I remember at uni that feeling of genuinely not being able to force myself to do the work, even though I knew I needed to. But that's not the case here because after trying to deny it, Nagi breaks down and admits to himself he did truly enjoy it. I think he needed to hit rock bottom, as Barou said, to really appreciate it. We've seen him have these moments of excitement and fire, which was a real frustrating thing during his decline, that it was almost as though he was forgetting about a lot of his earlier development where the idea of a challenge got him fired up. And now he's back to what he thought he wanted before Blue Lock, where nothing's a pain, there's nothing disturbing him, he can just chill and game all day, and he hates it, right? But obviously in chapter 34 of episode Nagi, we see that he doesn't want that at all, that the one thing he's afraid of is losing that fire forever. He wants to stay fired up. Interestingly, his fear wasn't losing football, but losing that fire. Although, as we see in 302, he doesn't think he'll ever find that kind of fire again. And that's obviously why he's so miserable, right? Because now he's back to this mundane life that he doesn't really enjoy. I don't think he was ever actually really happy with it. There's that line in the first selection, Nagi's life was filled with boredom until the moment he first felt that curiosity. So I think he was just kind of comfortable with how he was living. There was never any hassle, except now he knows what he's missing out on. So he can't stay comfortable in it anymore. He can't feel content by just getting by from day to day because he knows there's more out there. Ironically, after all that time trying to get himself fired up and not being able to, now he's trying not to care and isn't able to. And it's honestly heartbreaking seeing him like this. That panel of why I'm so miserable, I was going to start writing about this yesterday, but after reading the chapter, it just genuinely made me sad last night. I just couldn't bring myself to start writing about it. The part where everyone else is having their conversations and he's just left there on his own. Thinking about how he's lost the one thing that ever sparked some excitement in him. And it's not hard to see the depth of his despair here. His regret at everything he did, or rather didn't do. But the big question here, and the one that's been going around and around in my head since last night, is of course, why didn't he try harder? And I think there's a few things going on here. Firstly, he's evidently lived his life up to this point, even in most of the first selection of Blue Lock, just kind of taking the path of least resistance. With nothing that's ever really caught his interest, so he's just tried to do the bare minimum needed to get by. And I think that kind of mindset was still ingrained into him. It's not something that you can just snap out of, and I spoke a bit about this on my recent video on Nagi, but I think he saw not being fired up as something's wrong and I need to fix it immediately. So for instance, in the Manshine game, when things weren't going his way and he couldn't see a way to beat Isagi after trying once, the only thing he could see to change was teaming up with Rhea again. The point being, he won't try unless he's fired up. He's not at all willing to push for discomfort because he's too obsessed on having that fire. He's too focused on having that every second of every match. And it's easy to see why if he's never had it before, but it's not natural for it to always be there. And I think this is something I'm quite guilty of myself. As soon as I feel a little off with anything, I'm overanalyzing it, trying to figure out what the problem is, what I need to change, when the answer is probably just nothing. And I think that specifically is probably what he's regretting right now. Why couldn't I just try harder in the moments where it wasn't easy for him? Even when Chris Prince was trying to give him some advice, to him it was just a hassle, it was too much effort, it was too tiring. And I think, funnily enough, I mentioned this in my Chris Prince video like 2 years ago, despite being completely unrelated to Nagi at the time, just by pure coincidence. But not every aspect of whatever you decide to do is going to be fun, right? I work full-time outside of this channel, but Also, when it comes to these videos, I love writing the script, but I'm not going to pretend that sometimes it's not a real pain trying to find this specific 2-second clip to go in the video, or I remember a manga panel, but I can't remember what chapter it is, so I'm digging through like 30-40 chapters trying to find it, just to put on screen for like 5 seconds or so. Or to be honest, the one part I find a real drag is the upload screen, right? If you're a YouTuber, you'll probably know this. You've got like 50 different things to fill in, you know, the tags and the description, and honestly, I find it a real pain, right? The point being that it's all worth it in the end, but for me to do all the exciting stuff like writing the script and most of the editing, you've also got to do some like boring stuff, right? And in Nagi's case, if he wants the rush of these moments where he pulls off something beyond what he thought he could do, he's got to be willing to do some boring stuff, right? Like take on Prince's advice. You know, he's clearly doing a ton of physical training, which I doubt he was that excited about, but he's got to be able to improve at it and, you know, to be able to keep playing more and keep getting more of that feeling he wants. And I think a lot of this boils down to him not realizing or not accepting just how much work he's got to do to continue to play at this level. Because he's obviously always gotten by until now without having to actually try. So I don't think he's ever really appreciated that. You know, I don't think he'd ever actually considered that he would be eliminated either. You know, I think that thought was there, but I don't think he ever actually thought it was going to happen to him. But, you know, I'm sure I've spoken about that a ton in the previous couple videos. So the very last thing is, and writing this part ended up being a bit of a rabbit hole, that he never really had a goal he believed in, because I don't think he ever cared about the World Cup, right? And we already know this. It was just kind of going along because of what Rio said. The only goal he's ever had that interested him was beating Isagi. And of course, once he scored that one goal against him, he considered that achieved and couldn't find another fire. But there's a few interesting bits going on here in light of the previous 2 chapters. Firstly, remember how Isagi's goal was beating Kaiser? How come when he achieved that, his fire stuck around but Nagi's didn't? Because it's 2 very similar goals, right? Beat Kaiser, beat Isagi. I mean, obviously, Kaiser and Isagi on the same team and Nagi and Isagi are on opposite teams, but regardless, right? And I think the main explanation here is that Kaiser was actually really just a stepping stone. You know, Isagi's original goal, and his goal has always been to be the best in the world, or specifically in this case it was to surpass Noah, right? But he realized that was way too far off, so he went for Kaiser instead. You know, the exact wording I think he used was, Kaiser is this goal in between Noah and what he can currently do. So the reason that's important is because it meant he automatically had his next goal afterwards. You know, he obviously even challenged Noah in 284 before he felt like he'd truly beaten Kaiser. Whereas Nagi didn't have that. He didn't have the next step, which is why he ended up so directionless. And a little side note actually, because I mentioned him in the middle of writing this Isagi script, I think Blue Lock is setting some very interesting seeds for a complete shift in its message later on. Because an interesting question, I mentioned how Isagi already had his next goal, right? And I'd love to see the comments on this, but what is Isagi going to do after he becomes the best in the world, right? Because in 301 he spoke about never being satisfied until he reaches that goal. But then what, right? I don't think he'll become completely directionless or anything like that, because he just genuinely enjoys the sport itself a lot. And I don't think you always need an answer for something that's so far off in the distance anyway, right? But there's a trap that a lot of us have done before. I've done a ton, right? Of feeling like it's an obligation for us to achieve something. You know, I remember I did this a lot in school, like, oh, I have to achieve this grade just because, right? I felt obligated to. And when that happens, in my experience anyway, there's no rush when you reach it. There's not even any degree of like happiness or satisfaction. It's just a brief bit of relief and then, oh, okay, now what? You know, I'll probably speak more about it in the next Isagi video. I don't think it's going to happen to Isagi, but maybe you can see the point I'm making here. Returning to Nagi, I do think a huge chunk of this is just down to him not really feeling the pressure and it not really dawning on him what was going to happen if he didn't put the work in. Back in chapter 49, after him and Isagi lost to Rin for the first time, we see him flip on Isagi because he concretely knows what will happen if they lose again. One of them will be eliminated. And I spoke before about how Nagi thrives with more short-term, concrete goals. And I think with the salary system being what it is, there was never a sense of if you lose this match you're out. It wasn't as simple as just saying, oh, this is the bare minimum I need to do to be able to survive. Sure, a goal pretty much would have guaranteed his survival, but going into this game, there wasn't a sense of, oh, if he doesn't score, he's out, right? In fact, it seemed pretty likely that he would survive, kind of regardless of what happened. When he's talking to Rio in 247, Rio's the one who's far more worried about the pair of them going out, but he even describes Nagi as being in the safe zone at 40 million, who's really just more concerned about the lack of fire he has. And I can't help but feel like if Nagi was told, if you lose this game, you're out, we would have seen a very different Nagi. And so the final question is, what could Nagi have done differently? Did he need to be eliminated for all of this to dawn on him? And probably, honestly. As Barou said, he needed to hit rock bottom in despair, but up until now, there was nothing that could have actually felt like rock bottom to him. He didn't actually care enough. Perhaps the one thing could have been if he finished 23rd, like right on the border. If he got lucky enough for that, then that might have been the slap in the face he needed to, get serious from here on out. But I'm really glad the story didn't do that because this is way more interesting. But I've been thinking about, as I mentioned, when I was at uni, and I couldn't force myself to care or do any of the work I needed to do. And I kept thinking to myself something pretty similar, I'll be fine, I've always gotten by like this. There was no urgency, obviously very similar to Nagi's situation. And I've been thinking, looking back, what could I have done to snap myself out of that? Because I ended up getting lucky and COVID arrived just as I was going to do my finals, so I ended up just getting what I got on my second year, which was a first. But if that hadn't happened, was the only answer for me to just fuck up that year? Is that the only thing that would have gotten me to start working again? I assume there would have been a point where I got close enough to the exams that my brain would have just switched on. But outside of that, there probably were things I could have done, right? Like going to the uni library, I would have had to get up at 5 a.m. because it was always full. But a different environment would have probably helped, or finding someone to study with or whatever, right? There was things I could have done. But I think in Nagi's case, it's actually quite different. And I've covered quite a lot of that in this video here. He took the route of making things easier instead of improving himself and wasn't willing to push for discomfort and things like that. But once it had happened, I think as Ego said, it was kind of a point of no return. I think after that, there wasn't actually that much he could do. Maybe if he set himself a smaller, more concrete goal, like just score in the last game instead of the kind of vague, unexciting, let's make plays for our team that Rio came up with. But I think he needed this reality check because obviously he's never really experienced defeat, right? Besides that one game to Isagi and one game to Rin. But neither of them actually mattered that much, right? That first one especially, Team V got through regardless, right? I think he needed to experience what it was like to properly fail. But I've spoken about that a ton in previous videos. I just wanted to make a little follow-up now that we know what his response to this is. I do think he's almost certainly going to come back despite episode Nagi ending. I think he'll want to claw back to get a place in the Adult World Cup. This is kind of the equivalent of Isagi losing at Nationals, and we saw where he went from there, right? When he realized, oh, I wanted to win a lot more than I realized, So I think things do look up for Nagi to return. I think episode Nagi is just ending because it's going to be a long time before he does, right? It's going to be at minimum the Adult World Cup. And again, this happened to Snuffy and he was able to come back from it, right? Obviously, Mick Moon didn't, so it is possible there's some sort of parallel here where he's not going to come back the same way Mick Moon didn't, and Rio will just carry on. But I'm personally not expecting that. I think we are going to see Nagi at some point, and it's going to be extremely interesting to see what that answer is. Because obviously I spoke about him having short, concrete goals. That's not really an option for him anymore, unless he just works his way up the ladder. If he wants to get back to Blue Lock as such, it's going to have to be the Adult World Cup, which is a long, long way off with not a particularly clear route at the moment either, so very interested to see where that goes. Thank you very much for watching. Shout out to Bonryu and Anne, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and Florian Stenger, especially for joining the King tier of my Patreon, much appreciated. This will be the last Nagi video, don't worry. Isagi's up next. See you again soonish for that.